There's a moment that happens inside the avoidant that's completely different from anything they felt when you first left. When you initially left, when the relationship first ended, what they felt was complicated but manageable. Relief mixed with sadness. Confirmation of their narrative that relationships end. The comfortable familiarity of being alone again, which their nervous system has always treated as safer than being close. The initial separation, as painful as it may have been on the surface, left something intact that made it bearable. Possibility. The door was closed, but not locked. You were gone, but not permanently. The loss was real, but reversible if they ever decided to reverse it. That possibility was their safety net, and they didn't know it was their safety net until it disappeared. Because there comes a moment, not at the beginning, not in the early weeks of separation, but later, sometimes months later, sometimes longer, when the safety net is removed completely, when the evidence accumulates to the point where their defenses can no longer protect them from a specific, devastating, inescapable recognition. You are never coming back. Not probably not. Not unlikely. Never. The door isn't just closed, it's gone. The possibility isn't just distant, it's been permanently extinguished. You're not waiting for them to change. You're not organizing your life around the hope of their transformation. You've moved, you've built, you've become someone whose life has no space for them in it, not because you're punishing them, but because you genuinely left and genuinely continued and genuinely created a future that doesn't include them and never will. That recognition is what's hitting them hard right now, and understanding exactly what it's doing to them, why it lands with this specific force, why it's worse than the original separation, what it's dismantling inside them. This changes everything about how you understand what you survived and why moving forward is the only thing that makes sense. Why this hits harder than the original loss. The initial separation didn't fully land. That sounds strange, but it's psychologically precise. The avoidance defensive system is extraordinarily well designed for managing the anxiety of closeness. That's what it was built for. But it has a specific vulnerability that most people don't understand. It was not designed to manage the full weight of permanent loss. It was designed to manage the threat of connection, and those are different threats that activate different responses. When you left initially, their defense managed it through a mechanism that's automatic and mostly unconscious. Hope. Not hope in the active, reaching sense. Passive hope. Background hope. The quiet, unexamined assumption that you would still be there if they decided they wanted you. That the door, however closed it appeared, remained openable from their side. This assumption didn't require them to consciously think about you or actively plan to reconcile. It just sat underneath everything as a structural belief that the option existed, that the loss was reversible, that they maintained the control they always maintained by being the one who could choose to re-engage or not. This background hope is what protected them from feeling the full weight of losing you. You cannot fully grieve something you believe you can restore. The avoidant was never fully grieving you. They were managing the temporary discomfort of your absence while unconsciously relying on the availability of a future they hadn't decided to pursue yet. Your permanent unavailability removes that option completely, irreversibly. And when the option disappears, the grief that was being deferred by its existence arrives all at once, not as a gradual process, but as the sudden removal of a floor they didn't know they were standing on. That's the falling you can feel when you understand what's happening to them right now. They're falling into the full, unprotected, undeferred weight of losing you permanently. And the fall is so much worse than the original separation because there's nothing to break it. No possibility of restoration, no sense of control over outcome, no ability to manage the situation through the strategies that have always worked before. They're experiencing what their patterns actually cost. Finally, completely, without the buffer that your continued availability, even as a theoretical future option, was providing. The specific moments that made it undeniable. It didn't arrive as single revelation. It arrived through specific moments, each one adding weight until the combined evidence became something their defenses couldn't process away. Let me walk you through exactly what those moments looked like. The first was when they reached out and the response, or the absence of response, made clear that the door wasn't just closed, but gone. The avoidant eventually reaches. They always do. Maybe it's a casual text, designed to seem low stakes, but is actually testing whether you're still available. Maybe it's something more direct, an expression of regret, an acknowledgement of what they lost, a question that's really asking whether there's still a chance. They reach out expecting one of the responses that came earlier in the separation: warmth, engagement, some signal that the possibility still lives. Instead, they get something different: silence, or polite distance that communicates finality without cruelty, or direct, clear words that leave no room for interpretation. You've moved on. You wish them well. This chapter is closed. The response, whatever form it takes, is the first concrete evidence that the assumption was wrong. You're not waiting. You're not available. The reaching found nothing to hold on to, and the nothing is devastating in a way that an angry response or a wounded response never would have been, because anger or hurt would have meant you still cared enough to feel. The nothing means you've moved past the stage where their reach even fully lands. The second was seeing you genuinely happy without them, not just functioning, not just surviving the loss, actually happy, invested in your life, present in your own existence in ways that the relationship, with all its energy drain and emotional management, was preventing. They see this through social media, or through mutual friends, or through an actual encounter, and what they see isn't the version of you they expected. They expected some version of struggling, some evidence that losing them cost you in ways that are still visible. Instead, they see someone who looks lighter than they did in the relationship, more fully themselves, clearly not waiting for anything. This observation destroys several defensive narratives simultaneously. The narrative that you needed them specifically and would eventually recognize it. The narrative that what you shared was irreplaceable and you'd never find equivalent connection. The narrative that your happiness was somehow dependent on their presence in your life. All of these narratives require a version of you that's diminished by their absence. And the version of you they're seeing is not diminished. The version of you they're seeing is expanded, which means the narratives were wrong, which means everything built on those narratives was wrong. The third was when they experienced something significant, an achievement, a crisis, a moment that mattered, and their instinctive response was to tell you, except they couldn't. You weren't there for this. You weren't available for the ordinary significant moments that make up a life. And the absence in that specific moment, when the instinct to reach for you activated and found nothing, made the permanence visceral rather than intellectual. This is different from knowing abstractly that the relationship is over. This is feeling the specific shape of the vacancy you left, the particular silence where your response would have been, the precise absence of the understanding you would have provided, the celebration you would have offered, the perspective that was uniquely yours. In that moment, the loss became specific in a way that abstract knowledge never produces. Not just losing a relationship, losing you. The specific, irreplaceable texture of your presence in their life. Gone. permanently from every future moment that matters. The fourth was attempting the grand gesture and receiving definitive rejection. They make their move. They find the courage or the desperation to be finally, fully vulnerable about what they lost and what they want back. They apologize with specificity. They acknowledge their patterns without defensiveness. They demonstrate the insight they've developed in your absence. They ask for another chance with the genuine humility that their pride made impossible while they had you. And you say no. Not, I need time. Not, show me you've changed. No. Final. Clear. Without cruelty, but without ambiguity. And you explain that it's not about whether they've changed. It's that you've moved beyond the stage where their changes matter for this particular question. The possibility closed. Not because of who they are, but because of where you are. You're gone in a way that their transformation doesn't reach. This rejection does something specific and devastating. It destroys the fantasy that was functioning as their last psychological protection. The fantasy that when they were finally ready, the option would still be there. That readiness, when it arrived, would find opportunity waiting. The rejection proves the fantasy false. Readiness arrived. The opportunity doesn't exist, and they have to sit with the specific torture of having finally become willing to try at the exact moment when their willingness is irrelevant. What's actually being dismantled inside them? The recognition of your permanent absence isn't just painful. It's structurally destabilizing in ways that reach the foundations of how the avoidant understands themselves and their relationship to the world. The first thing being dismantled is the safety net. Throughout the entire separation, even when they weren't thinking about you consciously, even when they were telling themselves and others they were fine, there was an unconscious structural assumption operating underneath everything. I could have her back if I decided I wanted her. This assumption wasn't examined. It was just there, functioning as invisible flaw, preventing the full weight of the loss from landing. Your permanent unavailability removes the flaw. There's nothing underneath anymore. The loss that was theoretical is now complete, and the grief that was being unconsciously deferred by the existence of possibility arrives without warning and without cushion. The second is their identity. The avoidant's entire sense of self is organized around a specific belief. I don't need anyone. I am self-sufficient. Independence is who I am, not just how I live. This belief is load-bearing. Everything else in their self-concept is built on it, and the pain they're experiencing right now is direct evidence that the belief is false. If they truly didn't need anyone, your permanent loss wouldn't hurt like this. If they were genuinely self-sufficient, the absence of your specific presence wouldn't create this specific void. The pain is the proof that the need exists, that it always existed, that the self-sufficient identity was constructed over the need rather than instead of it. This is identity crisis in the precise sense, not general distress, the specific experience of a foundational belief about who you are being revealed as false by your own involuntary responses. They cannot maintain the self-sufficient identity and acknowledge the pain simultaneously. One of them has to give. And the pain isn't something they can turn off, so the identity is the thing that's fracturing. The third is their sense of control. The avoidance defensive system requires control, specifically the sense of being the one who determines the terms of connection, the one who decides when to engage and when to withdraw, the one who leaves rather than being left. This control is what made intimacy feel manageable. Distance was always a choice they could make. Space was always something they could create. The relationship's terms were ultimately set by their willingness to participate. Your permanent departure strips every element of this control away. You determined the terms, you made the final decision, you set the terms of the ending, and the terms are not negotiable. They cannot withdraw from you because you've already withdrawn from them, completely and permanently. They cannot control whether they lose you because they've already lost you, and the loss is irreversible. They're left with no available moves in a situation where their entire defensive architecture is built around always having a move available. The powerlessness is not just uncomfortable, it's existentially threatening to how they've organized their entire approach to human relationship. Why this specific suffering is specific to avoidance. Other attachment styles experience loss. Other people grieve relationships. But what the avoidant is experiencing right now has a quality that's unique to their specific psychological organization. And understanding the uniqueness helps you see why this consequence is the precise and appropriate cost of their particular patterns. For other attachment styles, grief is painful, but uncomplicated in a specific sense. They can grieve what they knew they had. They knew the relationship mattered while they were in it. They allowed themselves to know it. The loss is painful because the love was real and acknowledged, and now it's gone. The avoidant is experiencing something fundamentally different and in some ways worse. They're grieving what they didn't let themselves know they had until it became impossible to have. They're recognizing your value after the recognition is too late to do anything with. They're understanding what you are offering after the offer has been permanently withdrawn. The loss is compounded by the specific torture of knowing they caused it, not through malice, not through incompatibility, not through circumstances outside their control, but through the specific defended inability to recognize value while possessing it. They cannot comfort themselves with incompatibility. They can see clearly now that you were right for each other. They cannot comfort themselves with bad timing. They can see clearly that the timing was theirs to use and they didn't use it. They cannot comfort themselves with, "It wasn't meant to be," because they can see exactly how it was meant to be and exactly what prevented the meaning from being honored in time. The only available story is the true one. They had something extraordinary. They treated it as ordinary, and they lost it permanently through the specific patterns they were unwilling or unable to address while you were still there to be lost. That story has no comfortable exit. It just sits there, accurate and unrelenting, as the explanation for everything they're experiencing. And they have to live inside that story every day, without the option of rewriting it through action, because the action that could have mattered is no longer available. What this means for you and why it confirms everything. Here's what the avoidant's current devastation actually tells you, not about them, about the entire experience you just survived. It confirms your perception was accurate the entire time. The connection you sensed was real. The significance you felt was real. The relationship's potential was real. Everything you were trying to build was genuinely worth building. The avoidant's current suffering about losing it permanently is the clearest possible evidence that the thing you believed you had together was not a fantasy. You weren't overestimating it. You weren't projecting significance onto something ordinary. It was significant. Their devastation at its permanent loss is the proof. It confirms that leaving was the right decision. If your permanent unavailability is what's finally producing consequences for their patterns, if losing you forever is what's finally making the cost of their defensive behavior undeniable, then your staying would have prevented this. Your continued presence would have continued absorbing the cost of their patterns without those patterns ever producing consequences significant enough to motivate change. You leaving transferred the consequences to where they belong. That transfer is what's producing whatever growth or reckoning or honest self-examination they're currently being forced into. You couldn't have produced it by staying, only by leaving completely. And it confirms that your value was never the question. Your adequacy was never in doubt. The relationship didn't fail because you weren't enough, or because you wanted too much, or because your needs were excessive. The relationship failed because one person couldn't show up for what was being offered while they had access to it. And the magnitude of their suffering at losing access permanently is the clearest possible measure of exactly how much was being offered and how completely they failed to honor it in time. The only response. This moment deserves their suffering is real. The devastation of this recognition is genuine, and none of it creates any obligation on your part. You are not responsible for relieving the consequences of their patterns. You are not obligated to soften your permanent unavailability because they're finally feeling its weight. You are not required to reopen a door you've thoughtfully, deliberately, with full understanding of what you were closing, decided to close permanently. Their pain is natural consequence. Natural consequences are appropriate. They're actually the only mechanism through which genuine reckoning with patterns becomes possible. Let it hit them hard, not out of cruelty, out of respect for the natural order of things, the order in which choices have consequences, patterns have costs, and taking something extraordinary for granted produces the specific suffering of recognizing what you destroyed after it's too late to restore it. And you continue, you build. You become more fully yourself in the space that used to be occupied by managing someone else's emotional unavailability. You invest your extraordinary capacity for love and patience and understanding into a life that can actually receive it, into people who recognize your value in real time, into work that honors your energy, into a future built on what's actually available rather than what might theoretically become available if the right conditions were ever met. The avoidant is sitting with the permanent loss of you. The weight of it is hitting them in ways nothing else could hit them. The recognition that you're never coming back is dismantling defenses and fracturing identity and producing the kind of reckoning that only irreversible loss creates. And you are already gone, already forward, already building, already living the life that the relationship was preventing, already being the person who was always there underneath the depleted, overextended, constantly reaching version of yourself that the dynamic required. It's hitting them hard that you're never coming back. Let it. You're not coming back. And that is exactly, precisely, finally, the right answer. And I want to stay with that phrase for a moment, the right answer, because I think it deserves more than the declarative confidence it sounds like when you first hear it. Because the right answer, in this context, isn't something that arrived cleanly or easily or without cost. It arrived through a process that was genuinely difficult, through months or possibly years of trying, adjusting, hoping, interpreting ambiguous signals in the most generous possible light, giving chances that weren't honored, extending patience that wasn't reciprocated, and finally, not dramatically, not in a single moment of clarity, arriving at the understanding that the only sustainable answer was the one that chose you. The right answer wasn't obvious when you were in it. That's worth acknowledging. From inside the dynamic, from inside the experience of loving someone whose patterns kept preventing what you were trying to build, the right answer looked complicated. It looked like maybe if you just communicated differently, maybe if you created safer conditions, maybe if you gave it more time, maybe if you tried once more in a slightly different way. The right answer was obscured by your genuine love for this person, by your accurate perception of their potential, by your completely understandable hope that the relationship could become what you both needed it to be. The right answer only became clear when you were finally willing to stop obscuring it, with hope that the evidence had stopped supporting. That clarity cost you something, and it's worth naming what it cost before we talk about what it's given you. because the cost is real and deserves acknowledgement rather than being rushed past in a hurry to arrive at the triumphant version of the ending. What it actually cost you to get here. You paid in time, real, irreplaceable time that was organized around someone who couldn't reciprocate the organization. Months or years in which your emotional energy was primarily directed toward a relationship that was requiring more than it was returning. Time in which you were patient and understanding and generous in ways that weren't matched, that were received but not reflected, appreciated but not reciprocated in the ways that would have made the relationship sustainable. That time is gone. You don't get it back. And while it's true that nothing is wasted if you learn from it, that truth doesn't eliminate the real cost of having spent significant time in a dynamic that couldn't give you what you needed. You were there. You tried. It didn't work. And the years it took to arrive at that conclusion are years you'll carry differently than you would have carried years spent in genuine mutual partnership. You paid in self-doubt. The specific, corrosive self-doubt that comes from loving someone whose behavior consistently suggested you were too much, while your instincts consistently told you your needs were completely normal. The self-doubt of wondering, in quiet moments, whether the relationship failed because of something fundamental about you, the way you love, the things you need, the intensity with which you feel, whether you were the problem that their withdrawal was a reasonable response to. This self-doubt was planted by the dynamic and watered by repeated experiences of reaching and not being met. And even when you know intellectually that your needs were normal and your love was extraordinary, the emotional residue of sustained self-doubt doesn't simply evaporate with intellectual clarity. It has to be worked through, experienced, contradicted through new evidence, gradually replaced by self-knowledge that is rooted in something more stable than another person's capacity to meet you. You paid in the specific grief of the almost, not the grief of something that was never possible. That grief, though painful, has clean edges. The grief of something that was possible, that you could see clearly, that existed in the space between what you were offering and what they could have received if their patterns hadn't prevented them from receiving it. The almost is its own category of loss. The relationship that could have been, the person they almost were in the moments the defenses came down. The future you could see even when the present kept failing to support it. Grieving the almost is harder than grieving the impossible because it requires accepting that what was lost wasn't inevitable. It was chosen by their patterns, by their unwillingness or inability to do the work that would have changed their capacity. The almost was real, and losing it is real, and the grief of it is real, and it doesn't resolve on a convenient timeline just because you've arrived at clarity about the right answer. You paid these things, the time, the self-doubt, the grief of the almost. They were real costs extracted by a real dynamic that required things from you that weren't returned in kind. Acknowledging the cost isn't self-pity, it's honesty. And honesty about what you paid is what allows you to receive fully what the payment produced, because what it produced is real too, and significant, and worth understanding completely. What you actually gained that can't be taken from you. Here's what exists on the other side of the cost. Not as consolation, as actual, concrete, permanent acquisition that belongs to you regardless of what happens next. You gain the specific self-knowledge that only genuine testing produces. You know things about yourself now that easier experiences couldn't have taught you. You know where your patience actually lives, not where you believed it lived before you were tested, but where it actually is, what it actually looks like when extended to its real limit, what it feels like when it finally runs out. You know what your love looks like under sustained pressure. You know what you're capable of giving, even when giving isn't being reciprocated. You know how long you can sustain hope against accumulating evidence. You know what it finally takes for you to choose yourself. This self-knowledge is not comfortable knowledge. Comfortable knowledge doesn't require anything of you to acquire. This knowledge required you to be tested at your actual edges, not your theoretical edges, not the edges you imagined you had before the experience, but your real edges. And the map of your real edges is something that serves you in every relationship and every significant human connection you navigate for the rest of your life. You're not guessing about yourself anymore in the ways you were guessing before this experience. You gained the discernment that only this specific experience could develop, the ability to read avoidant patterns earlier and more accurately than you could before, to distinguish between someone who is private and someone who is unavailable, between someone who needs time to trust and someone whose patterns mean trust, once extended, still won't produce the vulnerability and presence that genuine relationship requires, between someone who is genuinely working on themselves in ways that produce behavioral change and someone who has developed the ability to discuss their patterns without the discussion producing any results in how they actually show up. This discernment is not the same as cynicism. It's not a defensive closing that treats every defended person as permanently unavailable. It's the specific, earned, experience-based capacity to see more accurately and assess more honestly without needing to accumulate as much evidence before the picture becomes clear. It's pattern recognition that operates earlier in new connections, not as suspicious surveillance, but as natural reading of what's actually being communicated by behavior rather than by words. You will use this discernment for the rest of your life. It will protect you in ways you won't always be consciously aware of. It will make future decisions clearer and faster and more rooted in reality than they would have been without the development this experience forced. You gain the embodied knowledge of what it feels like to finally choose yourself, not the idea of it, the actual felt experience, the specific texture of what happens inside you when you stop organizing yourself around someone else's availability and start organizing around your own needs and your own life and your own genuine forward movement. That experience is now yours. In a way, it wasn't before. You've lived it. Your nervous system has encoded it. The next time you're in a situation that requires you to choose yourself, and there will be a next time because life keeps offering those situations, you'll have a reference point. You'll know what it feels like from having done it. And having done it once makes doing it again more available. Not easy, more available. And you gained, this one is perhaps most important, the permanent, evidence-backed, experience-confirmed knowledge of your own value. Not because someone adequately honored it while they had it, paradoxically, because someone failed to honor it while they had it and is now devastated by losing it permanently. Their current devastation is the clearest possible evidence of exactly how valuable you were and are. You don't have to take anyone's word for it. You don't have to derive it from someone adequately loving you. You have direct evidence, their suffering at your permanent absence, that your value is real and significant and not something that was in question. Only what you did with it and what they were capable of recognizing in real time were ever in question. The person you're becoming in the space this created. When a relationship ends that was consuming significant energy, and this kind of relationship, the kind that requires you to manage your own emotional expression to avoid triggering the other person's defensive withdrawal, the kind that requires you to reach consistently without being consistently met, the kind that requires sustained hope against accumulating evidence. When that relationship ends, something happens that you might not have fully noticed yet because it happens gradually. The energy returns. Not all at once, not immediately, but gradually, as the weeks and months accumulate, as the new life you're building gains its own momentum, as the emotional bandwidth that was consumed by monitoring and reaching and hoping becomes available for other things. The energy that the relationship was extracting starts coming back. And when it comes back, it's available for you in ways it hasn't been for a significant period of time. You're becoming someone with more capacity than you had inside the dynamic, more emotional bandwidth, more creative energy, more presence in your own life rather than in the management of someone else's availability. This expansion is happening whether you're consciously directing it or not. It's the natural result of no longer being in a relationship that was requiring more than it was returning. But you can also consciously direct it. You can intentionally invest the returning energy in the specific directions that the relationship was preventing. What was getting backgrounded while the relationship was consuming your primary attention? What goals, what relationships, what aspects of yourself were receiving your secondary energy while your primary energy was directed toward trying to make something work that couldn't work? Those things are waiting, not in a dramatic, urgent way, in the quiet way that real parts of yourself wait, available, patient, ready to be invested in when the conditions allow. This is the practical shape of what moving forward actually looks like. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden arrival of everything you wanted. The gradual, quiet, genuine expansion of someone who is no longer being contracted by a relationship that required them to be smaller than they actually are. You're not performing wellness. You're not rushing into the performance of having moved on. You're actually, slowly, in the real and unglamorous way that genuine forward movement works, becoming more fully yourself than you were able to be inside the dynamic that just ended. The avoidant, watching this from whatever distance their access to you allows, is seeing exactly this. They're not seeing a diminished version of you, struggling with the loss. They're seeing the expanded version, the version that exists when the contraction of the relationship is removed, and the expanded version is more compelling, more fully alive, more completely yourself than the version they had access to while the relationship was requiring so much of you. Their recognition of your value is being fed by exactly this, by watching you become more of yourself rather than less, by observing that your life is gaining rather than losing, by understanding that the permanent absence they're suffering from is not diminishing you, but is demonstrating every day that you are always more than what the relationship was allowing you to be. A direct conversation about what happens when they reach out again. Because they will. If they haven't already, they will. The recognition that you're never coming back doesn't always stay as quiet, internal devastation. Sometimes it produces action, a reach, an attempt, a message or gesture or appearance that is trying to test whether the permanent door is actually permanent or whether permanent was negotiable. You need to be prepared for this, not in a strategic sense, in an emotionally grounded sense. Prepared enough that the reach, when it comes, doesn't catch you in the gap between what your clear mind knows and what your body still feels. Here's what their reaching out will feel like. It will feel like exactly what you always wanted. The person who couldn't reach, reaching. The person who couldn't be vulnerable, being vulnerable. The person who pushed you away, pulling toward you. And every part of you that spent months or years hoping for exactly this will respond to it. Your nervous system will respond to it. The attachment that was real, because it was real, will respond to it. That response is not weakness. It's not evidence that you haven't healed enough. It's evidence that you genuinely cared about this person. And genuine care doesn't dissolve cleanly on a timeline you control. Let yourself feel the response. Don't shame it. Just don't let it make the decision. Because here's what they're reaching out actually is. It's the reach of someone who is in acute activation from the recognition of permanent loss. It's real. Their feeling is genuine, but feeling produced by acute loss. Anxiety is situational. It belongs to the emotional state they're in, not to capacity they've developed. And the moment that emotional state shifts, the moment the acute anxiety of potentially losing you permanently is resolved by your response indicating the door isn't actually as closed as it appeared, the state changes. And when the state changes, the behavior that the state was producing changes with it. You've watched this dynamic operate before. From the other side of it, when you were the one whose pursuit resolved their anxiety and whose resolution of their anxiety produced the return of distance. Now the positions have shifted. You're not obligated to be the resolution of their anxiety. You're not required to provide relief from the consequences they're experiencing. You can receive their reach, you can feel what you feel in response to it, and still maintain the understanding that the door being permanently closed is not cruelty. It's clarity. It's the specific clarity that comes from having accumulated enough experience with this particular person's particular patterns to know what's on the other side of the door if you open it again. What's on the other side is not the person they're presenting in the reach. The person in the reach is activated, temporary, genuine in their feeling, and limited in their capacity. What's on the other side is the person they actually are across time. In the ordinary moments, in the comfortable moments, in the moments when the acute anxiety of potentially losing you is no longer motivating behavior because it's been resolved by your return. That person is who you actually have the history with. That person is who you actually accumulated the evidence about. And your door being permanently closed to that person is not a mistake. It's the product of exactly the accurate assessment that your entire experience with them produced. What the permanent door actually protects. The door being permanently closed isn't only about protecting you from returning to something that hurt you. It's protecting something more valuable than that. It's protecting the version of you that exists on this side of the closing. The version that chose themselves. The version that finally stopped reaching towards someone who couldn't reach back with equivalent investment. The version that made the decision, difficult, costly, against the pull of genuine attachment, to prioritize their own well-being over the continuation of a relationship that was extracting more than it was providing. That version of you is new, not in the sense of being unfamiliar. You've always had this capacity. It's been there the whole time, underneath the patience and the hoping and the trying. But new, in the sense of being currently activated, currently expressed, currently living in the choices you're making rather than sitting dormant underneath them. The version of you that knows how to choose themselves is new to the surface, and it's fragile in the specific way that newly surfaced things are fragile, not because it lacks strength, but because it hasn't yet had enough time to establish itself as the default. Opening the door to someone whose patterns produce the need for this version of you to emerge in the first place would put that version at risk, would ask the newly surfaced capacity for self-choosing to compete with the powerful, well-established pull of genuine attachment to a specific person whose patterns are unchanged, despite the intensity of their current feeling. That's a hard competition. And losing it wouldn't just mean returning to a relationship that didn't work. It would mean losing the specific version of yourself that the entire cost of the experience produced. The permanent door protects that version, not indefinitely. You're not closing yourself off from love or from vulnerability or from genuine connection with people who have the capacity to honor it. You're closing off this specific door to this specific person whose patterns made the emergence of this specific version of you necessary. That's not the same thing as closing off. It's discernment. It's the specific, hard-earned, experience-backed ability to know the difference between the door that should remain open and the door that should remain closed. The life being built on the other side of the door. I want to end with something concrete, not abstract reassurance about future love, something specific about what the life you're building actually looks like, because you deserve specificity rather than comfort. The life being built on the other side of the permanent door is quieter than you might expect. Not in a diminished way, in the specific way that a life organized around your own genuine needs and rhythms is quieter than a life organized around managing someone else's emotional unavailability. Less noise, less monitoring, less of the specific low-grade anxiety that comes from being in a relationship where the other person's emotional state is something you're continuously reading and responding to. That quiet is not emptiness. It's the specific texture of space that belongs to you. Space that was previously occupied by the dynamic, by the reaching and the hoping and the managing and the interpreting, that is now available for whatever you genuinely want to put in it. The quiet is what genuine forward movement feels like before it gets loud again with the new things you're building in it. Let it be quiet for a while. The quiet is not a sign that something is wrong or missing. It's evidence that something is finally right. The avoidant is loud right now. Loud with the recognition of permanent loss. Loud with the internal crisis their defensive architecture is struggling to contain. Loud with the reaching and the reckoning and the realization arriving too late to change anything. Their internal world is full of the specific noise of someone whose carefully maintained structure is fracturing under the weight of consequence. Your internal world is getting quieter, cleaner, more genuinely yours. That's not an accident. That's the difference between living inside a dynamic that required you to constantly manage something versus living inside a life that is increasingly organized around what you actually need and want and value. The door is permanently closed. The avoidant is on the other side of it, experiencing what permanent loss actually feels like from the inside. And you are on this side of it, building, expanding, becoming, choosing yourself so consistently and so completely that the choice is starting to feel less like a decision and more like simply who you are. That's who you always were. The relationship just made it temporarily harder to see. The door closed, and you became visible again. To yourself first. And then, when the time is right, when the grief has run its course and the building has gained its own momentum and the quiet has done its work, to someone who will see you clearly from the very beginning. Not after losing you, not after the permanent door closes, from the very first moment. Because some people don't need to lose extraordinary things to understand that they're extraordinary. Some people just know, and those people are who the permanent door was always making room for.